I assume you're
Hello,
able to see the screen?
go ahead. Yes, we can see your screen. Perfect. All right.
Perfect.
And hello, everyone. Welcome to our second think tank of the spring 2025 quarter here at UW. We have the wonderful Curry Cunningham, a professor at the College of Ocean and Fisheries Sciences at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, who's going to be talking today about exploring alternates or addressing spatial imbalance and catch rate observations. I'm going to go ahead and give you all the opportunity to unmute yourselves. So please go ahead and ask any questions during the presentation. It's meant to be interactive as we try to aim for most think tanks to be that way. So please go ahead, ask your questions during, inquire, and I'll go ahead and unmute you all now. So you'll have that ability as we go ahead. And now, Curry, please go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to be here and present at a think tank. It's been a couple years since my last think tank, so thanks to everyone who was able to make time. Over the course of this presentation, a sort of series of vignettes describing some of the research conducted in recent years by myself and in collaboration with members of my lab, thinking about how we utilize spatially referenced data to ask different questions about species distribution in space and time, to develop indices of abundance, and some of the considerations that have come out of that, especially when it comes to the question of spatial imbalance. So please do unmute yourself, ask questions. This is going to be much more fun if it's interactive than if it's me chatting away from the beginning. So first things first, in terms of kind of purpose and background, I think we're all well aware that spatially referenced fishery independent and fishery dependent catch rate data can really provide valuable insights into species distribution and abundance. But this question of sort of spatial imbalance, variation in the distribution of observations across time can present challenges, and that sort of imbalance can arise from a variety of different sources. It could be changes in survey design or effort over time in the context of fishery independent data. It can arise from preferential sampling by harvesters. I'll talk about an example of that when we're dealing with fishery dependent catch rate data. And often when we think about bringing together observations across different gear classes, of course, gear specific differences in catchability can present a major challenge in terms of our interpretation of either abundance indices across time or inference about spatial distribution, things like essential fish habitat or habitat associations. So just in terms of background, before we dive in, it's important to sort of think about the use cases we have or often have for species distribution models. We often use them in both retrospective and prospective contexts for spatial prediction. So thinking about a couple different things, at least here in the US, thinking about essential fish habitat definitions. That's maybe a retrospective application looking at the history of occupancy across space, across time, either in a static context or a dynamic context, and trying to infer areas or hotspots of abundance that we might identify as essential fish habitat. We also often use species distribution models to improve our understanding of spatial ecology, maybe the associations between where we see species and local environmental factors, either things that are static across time, like bathymetry, or things that vary across both time and space. In that case, I'm thinking about things like sea surface temperature, maybe chlorophyll A, whatever it might be. We also often, and in some cases, use SDMs to assess spatial bycatch risk. So I'll talk about a couple case studies where we're thinking about how we can use fishery-dependent observations of bycatch to predict areas that might be hotspots in the future, or at least get a better understanding of where those might be. So there's a range of use cases that we often see. Within kind of the range of those use cases, there's also a broad variety of tools, right? So I'm guessing most folks attending this meeting are fairly familiar with the standard frameworks we might use for developing species distribution models. So generalized additive models, using interactions between references and sort of latitude and longitude, or latitude, longitude, and time to describe spatial and spatiotemporal patterns. We can leverage methods like VAST, vector autoregressive spatiotemporal models, or STM-TMB, that are share the common feature of using Gaussian Markov random fields to describe spatial and spatiotemporal variation. And then we have sort of the other clade, which is machine learning methods, right? Sort of using supervised methods like boosted regression trees that allow us to identify sort of useful splits in both space and interactions between space and time that can be used for describing spatial variation and species distribution, or understanding relationships with environmental variables, whatever the use case might be. And so this question that often comes up, at least in the context of some of the work that we're doing, is sort of what's the best tool for the job? I of course like this figure from Stock's paper back in 2020, kind of comparing across these different estimation platforms the predicted distribution of blue sharp bycatch across space here from GLMs, GAMs, using Gaussian Markov random fields or random forests, and sort of the same general idea, right? So which of these methods is efficient for spatial prediction, and what are the trade-offs between them? And also trying to better understand, from a tools-based perspective, which of these tools that we might have at our disposal provides benefits in different use cases where the data are more or less spatially imbalanced, or where we have a mixture of gears, or depending on our purpose, whether we're thinking about, again, retrospective inference about distribution from an EFH perspective, or prediction into the future. So as I said before, my talk or this discussion is centered around a couple key case studies. And I want to highlight some of the work that's been done by former members of my lab. So Lillian Hart was a former master's student in my lab, and then Joe Langan was a former postdoc within my lab. And so they all contributed heavily to some of these various pieces of research. So I've tried to highlight them throughout just to acknowledge their contributions. But we'll generally look at sort of three different case studies. And the first is focused on estimating juvenile salmon abundance and essential fish habitat in the eastern and northern Bering Sea based on surface trawl survey data collected by the NOAA Alaska Fisheries Science Center EMA program. The second one is focused on sort of quantifying the distribution of salmon across the North Pacific and associations with temperature. This is based on a broad swath of survey data from a variety of survey efforts across countries organized under the North Pacific Anadromous Fish Commission. And the third kind of example or case study is focused on understanding Pacific herring distribution relative to some spatial management measures that are in place in the Bering Sea, herring savings areas conditional on fishery-dependent observations of bycatch from pelagic trawl fisheries in that region. So across these three sort of case studies, we have this kind of increasing level of spatial imbalance within the data, going from kind of a somewhat standardized or consistent survey design in the eastern and northern Bering Sea to this mixture of survey observations across gear types in the context of the NPAFC data in case study 2, all the way up to a fishery-dependent case study where we have large spatial imbalance in the data, some similarities in gear, but differences along the way. So diving into that first case study, and I want to give a huge thank you to the NOAA Alaska Fisheries Science Center Ecosystem Monitoring and Assessment Program that leads these surface trawl surveys that are conducted in the eastern and northern Bering Sea in collaboration with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. But generally, to give some background on what we might collectively call the southeastern Bering Sea and northern Bering Sea surface trawl surveys, formerly the BASIS Bering Sea Arctic Subarctic Integrated Surveys, but perhaps not the best descriptor now. These are surface trawl surveys that are conducted from September to October. They capture, among other species, the species of interest in this context are juvenile salmonids primarily in the year of outmigration. So I'm highlighting Bristol Bay sockeye up here, but a variety of species as we'll talk about. And in general, there's a couple benefits. One, I'll talk about how we use these data to inform essential fish habitat definitions or update essential fish habitat definitions for juvenile salmonids in this region, and also from a prediction context to think about how we can inform pre-season forecasts or estimates of abundance for returning adult salmon to Bristol Bay in subsequent years. But in general, one of the key features here, so what I have plotted here are the survey observations here. This is for sockeye salmon. This is the log CPUE here, generally across all of my figures, because I like Fisheries, right? We're going to have higher relative catch rate or relative abundance in yellow and lower relative catch rate in blue. Those gray points are areas, in fact, where they caught no sockeye salmon, juvenile sockeye salmon in the survey. So one of the things I want to point to is across time, there's been a lot of variation in both the overall level of survey effort from some years where it was fairly low, all the way up to some years where they sampled all the way up into the Chukchi Sea and beyond, up into the Arctic. And also this variation in more recent years over time, in which the southeastern Bering Sea is only surveyed basically in even years. And this will come back in the context when we think about spatial imbalance, right? So when we think about the tools we might use to either generate indices of abundance or describe kind of average spatial patterns, we really need to be concerned with the fact that we have this even odd year pattern, whether or not there are observations from the southeastern Bering Sea. That could be really important in terms of our interpretation of these data and any indices that come out. So there's a couple of motivating questions for sort of our consideration of these data in a couple different contexts. And so one was, how can we utilize these data to update essential fish habitat definitions for juvenile salmonids within this region of the eastern and northern Bering Sea? And can we utilize spatiotemporal models to address some of this spatial imbalance, even odd year pattern and variation across time in terms of survey effort to generate an index of juvenile abundance that we can use to inform our pre-season forecasts for adult return abundance of Bristol Bay sockeye salmon? So, and this formed the basis for a lot of Lillian Hart, pictured in the upper right-hand corner's master's thesis. But in general, the objectives were to quantify static and dynamic juvenile salmon essential fish habitat, so kind of core distributional areas by species, and also ask some questions about how variable those are across time and to what extent those might be associated with both static and dynamic environmental features. We also were interested in sort of comparing the predictions that were produced for this essential fish habitat, these areas of core areas of abundance across some different estimation platforms. So various ways we could implement parallel structures in GAMS and in VAST. So generally speaking, for the sort of first project, there were 4 model structures we explored, kind of building in complexity. So S of I is space, T of I is time, effort is in area swept in kilometers squared. And so we can think of kind of the basic or most basic null model that predicts the abundance or log abundance at a given point in space and time, conditional on a sort of average spatial field, plus of course an offset for effort. We can build on that, add in categorical year effects, right? Count for the average ups and downs in abundance across time while still estimating that average spatial field again being our sort of source of interest from at least a static essential fish habitat perspective. We also explored sort of 2 variants that included either what we might think of as correlated spatial fields that vary across time. So this interaction between time here and sort of year effects and space. So in a GAM context, it would be a smooth or basically the tensor product of latitude, longitude, and then year. And so you have this sort of smooth transition between in spatial fields across time. And then looking at sort of the discrete spatial fields across time. So true independence in those estimates of those spatiotemporal fields. We can, of course, set up kind of parallel implementations in VAST as well. So to the extent possible, we tried to do an apples to apples comparison of similar model structures across these two frameworks and across species. So thinking about kind of comparing these two SDM frameworks with application of these data, again, acknowledging that the sort of heavy spatial imbalance in the data, we compared, across species, across 4 juvenile salmon species, a couple of performance metrics, right? Kind of standard things that we often think about. So kind of within sample predictive performance or approximations, things like AIC and percent deviance explained. And then to quantify out of sample predictive performance, looked at basically tenfold cross validation and calculating the total negative log likelihood of the withheld observations from each fold across all 10 of those folds. And so there were a couple of insights that sort of came out, and these were fairly general across the sort of application to the juvenile pink chum and sockeye salmon data. Juvenile Chinook salmon were a little bit different, but generally, and maybe not unexpectedly, there was better within sample predictive performance for the sort of most complex model, so the dynamic spatiotemporal model with independent spatial fields, and that was across both sort of VAST and GAM parallel structures. However, out of sample predictive performance was better when, or at least was in with the sort of slightly reduced model that had kind of dynamic features, so sort of categorical year effects, and then year specific spatial fields that were correlated across time, right? So this interaction between latitude, longitude, and time in a general context. In general, kind of from a within sample perspective, the percent deviance explained was sort of slightly higher, but fairly comparable between the two platforms, but slightly higher for generalized additive models versus VAST. However, when we looked at sort of spatial residuals and sort of Dharma residuals in general, those seem to be a bit better for VAST compared with generalized additive models, so suggesting that it might be capturing some of the overall spatial variation a bit better. So aside from kind of the comparison of both within sample and out of sample measures of predicted performance, the question was like, does it matter all that much when we actually go back and predict either from a static EF essential fish habitat perspective, predict abundance density across space? Does it actually matter whether you use one of these platforms or the other? And the answer is not really. So what I have plotted here are the spatial predictions for abundance per kilometer squared. Again, more yellow colors, higher relative abundance density, cooler colors, lower. And so for juvenile Chinook salmon, juvenile sockeye salmon, and juvenile pink salmon, here on the left in each panel, predictions from the GAMs, on the right, predictions from VAST. And so in general, the same hotspots often appear here. So in general, for Chinook salmon, not unexpectedly, near the mouth of the Yukon River. For those who aren't familiar with the region, this is sort of the outflow of the Yukon River. It's the outflow of the Kuskokwim River. So this survey is encountering, in that perspective, Chinook salmon that have probably outmigrated sometime between April and June, maybe into July, to some extent, are being recaptured or captured in September, primarily August, September. So major producers of Chinook salmon in the region, higher relative abundance density near the mouths of those river systems. For sockeye salmon, again, here, Bristol Bay would be the largest producer of juvenile sockeye salmon across this region for sockeye entering the Bering Sea in general. whether you use a GAM or VAST, you sort of pick up that general signal with some general idea that the highest abundance or relative abundance density of juvenile sockeye salmon appears to sort of follow this sort of 50-meter isobath here. Pink salmon look a little bit different, a little bit further north, but again, across platforms, your spatial predictions are actually quite, and I thought surprisingly similar. When it comes to the actual essential fish habitat definitions, one of the definitions is sort of the area that's sort of inscribing the top 95% of predicted abundance. So if we generate these kind of EFH areas using both GAMs here in red or maybe pinkish here and VAST in blue, again, based on predictions from those two platforms. The area in purple is sort of the common or overlapping area between the essential fish habitat areas defined by fitting to the same data using one or the other of the two models. What we see at, and in green here is the existing essential fish habitat definition by species. What we see is that the majority of this is purple, right? In general, you end up with the same spatial prediction. Therefore, perhaps with the exception of pink salmon here, you get the same estimate of kind of the area that should be used to describe essential fish habitat, independent of whether or not you use a VAST or a GAM to define it, which is somewhat comforting, I think, from my perspective. The tool you use doesn't dictate at least in this context, the outcome we get, even with some of that sort of fairly substantial spatial imbalance in those survey observations among years. At least in describing static essential fish habitat definitions. We can ask the same question from a sort of dynamic EFH perspective, right? What if we sort of outline the area that inscribes the top 95% of predicted abundance for each year, and again, compare this between kind of the VAST and GAM implementations in this case, and what we see here is sort of the VAST predicted area describing the top 95% of predicted abundance. Same thing for a GAM here in red at this point. We see generally the same areas are described in particular years. So here in 2017, this is for juvenile sockeye salmon, maybe slightly different, maybe in some years, or across years, maybe a general tendency for the GAM predictions for that EFH definition to shrink a little bit, but certainly not in all years. But again, kind of comfortingly, across time, both of these estimates for that EFH definition, at least for a dynamic EFH definition, are fairly consistent, independent of the platform that you're using. I guess I'll stop after that sort of simple example and see if there's any questions from the audience, perhaps. Also, lets me take a drink of water. All right, hearing none, I'll move right along, but please do feel free to interrupt me along the way. The second case study I'll talk about leverages those same data. So we've already seen this sort of plot of the distribution of the EMA survey observations across time, and thinking about another use case. So number one, we were thinking about distribution, sort of defining static and dynamic essential fish habitat. In this context, for those who know me, I get very excited about Bristol Bay. I grew up fishing out in Bristol Bay as a drift net fisherman, and so one of my long-term research interests or research follies has been improving methods for generating predictions for return abundance of sockeye for Bristol Bay as one of the core faculty members for the UW Alaska Salmon Program. And so in this context, right, instead of trying to predict distribution conditional on these data, we're trying to generate an index of juvenile, in this case, sockeye salmon abundance that we can then relate to future returns of sockeye to Bristol Bay in the coming years and see whether or not it has any predictive value, right? So one of the key aspects, or I guess the core question is, can we use these surface trawl survey data to, I would say, reliably predict return abundance for Bristol Bay sockeye? And the reason we want to do this, so just to orient everyone, this is Bristol Bay. The fishery operates as a series of terminal fishing districts at the mouths of one or more river systems. So the Nushagak District, the Naknek-Kwijak Fishing District, the Igigik District, and the Ugashik District. This fishery is, I would say, famous and challenging because the majority of fish arriving to Bristol Bay arrive over a 2-week period of time. And we're talking about an incredible abundance of sockeye salmon returning. So part of the role that we play as the Alaska Salmon Program are to produce preseason forecasts for abundance that go out to the fishing industry in November of the year before these fish are returning. We also do in-season forecasting to sort of update those predictions, conditional on in-season information that's coming in from test fisheries and a variety of sources. So it's a very exciting place if you've never been there and you like salmon. But one of the challenges is that, so what I have plotted here is the total Bristol Bay run size by year from 1970 up through, this should be through 2004. And the first thing we'll see is that there's been incredible variability over time. So 2022 was the largest run on record to Bristol Bay. 83 million sockeye salmon returned. A little above 63 million, 62 million of those were harvested. Back in 1973, 3.6 million sockeye returned to Bristol Bay. So we've seen incredible heterogeneity in run size over time. We also see variability within that. Obviously is nested sort of return abundance by river system or return abundance by fishing district that leads to sort of the stability of the overall portfolio. But this is one of the sort of interesting challenges that comes out of Bristol Bay. There's variation in incredible variation in run size over time. From an in-season perspective, there's also variation in run timing and all these other aspects that make it very fascinating. But the things I'll point you to, obviously, 2022, largest run on record. 2015, this is 2015 here, we saw this swing between 2013, kind of a below average run, to a period of consistent above average productivity or return abundance for Bristol Bay as a whole. So starting again in 2014, 2015 here, all the way up really through 2024, although I'll talk about when we might be seeing a bit of a change. We've seen above average run sizes pretty consistently across this time in at or above, 50 million, primarily above 55 million fish. So, the methods that we have traditionally used to predict Bristol Bay run size often center around leveraging the return abundance of individuals from the same river system in prior years that spent 1 fewer, 2 fewer years in the ocean because they're this great integrator of the sort of early marine experience and therefore cohort strength or cohort survival. But the question was, can we make use of these sort of surface trawl survey data as an additional and somewhat independent predictor in and above the number of fish that returned in previous years, either within a river system or across river systems, plus some environmental covariates? Can we add in this index of abundance that's describing juvenile sockeye salmon in the year of outmigration, right? So what I have plotted here are basically the spatial predictions for abundance density coming out of a vast model fit to these data, right? In general, this survey, and this is limited to the juvenile life stage. So these are fish that are exiting these river systems in Bristol Bay, primarily May, June into July, mostly May and June for the most part, depends a little bit on river system. Then again, captured primarily in September in this survey. So what we see across time, so on the top up here, this is the outmigration year. The majority of sockeye salmon returning to Bristol Bay return after 2 or 3 years in the ocean. So down here in red, this is the return years, right? So a fish that went to sea in 2002 was indexed by the survey in 2002, would be returning as a 2 ocean fish in 2004 or a 3 ocean fish in 2005. Same thing down here. Fish that went to sea and were indexed by the 2024 survey are going to be returning as 2 ocean fish in 2026 and 3 ocean fish in 2027. So this also highlights kind of the second major benefit of trying to leverage these surface trawl survey data for preseason forecasting in Bristol Bay. rather than just using the abundance of individuals that returned in in the previous year or two, plus some environmental covariates, which give you a look 1 year into the future. This potentially provides some insight into return abundance 2 years down the line, which has some value, 2 to 3 years down the line. So in general, what you'll see across time, the highest predicted abundance density is in the as we saw before from an EFH perspective, right, is in the area surrounding Bristol Bay, right? Bristol Bay is the largest producer of sockeye in this region. Not unexpected. There's increasing production of sockeye salmon coming out of the Kuskokwim River, so a little bit further north here, but we're still talking about you know, some on average, you know, an order of magnitude lower, just kind of on average. We'll also see that there's variation across time, right? So thinking back to what we can kind of pick out if we, as I like to say, magic eye poster this, generally look for the areas where we, over time, we have higher relative abundance density versus years where we have lower relative abundance density. We can kind of pick out a couple different time periods. So the first, you know, basically starting in 2008, there's this period of lower overall abundance density across space for juvenile sockeye salmon. In about 2014, we see this period up through 2019 of higher relative abundance of or abundance density of sockeye, juvenile sockeye salmon. And so we can pick up these kind of 2 periods of time, right? When we look at the actual sort of spatially aggregated index of abundance that comes out, I mean, this is sort of evidenced in what we saw by eye. We have this period of kind of higher abundance all the way up through about 2007, starting in 2008 up through 2014 or 2013, period of lower abundance overall, followed by this period of higher abundance 2014 up through 2019, no survey in 2020 due to COVID-19, and then following that period, maybe a slight reduction in the abundance of juveniles caught in the year of outmigration. Of course, for, you know, to use this in a forward-looking predictive context to predict the return abundance of adults, you know, 2 and 3 years down the line, we need to convert this juvenile index in the year of outmigration that describes year-to-year variation in the abundance of juvenile sockeye in the year of ocean entry into this sort of return index, right? So we can basically align, you know, fish that went to sea in multiple years that were indexed by surveys in multiple years for a given return year. So 2025 season is just around the corner. If we're looking at an index of sort of return abundance for 2025, we need to look at the 2022 outmigrants that were indexed by the 2022 survey that are returning as 3 ocean fish, and the individuals that were indexed by the 2023 survey that would be returning as 2 ocean individuals in 2025. And so we can basically combine together 2 of these sort of year-specific indices for 2 and 3 ocean sockeye, 2 to 3 years down the line, and see how well we can predict run size based on these outmigration indices from prior years. And so when we do that, what we end up seeing, so this is this combined index, again, sort of looking forward across time, right? Combining together based on average age composition or average ocean age at return, basically the predicted juvenile, you know, overall juvenile relative abundance here, combining those together. This is the predicted index by return year. Again, we start to see sort of a pattern that was reflected in that original figure I showed, which is this increase basically after 2015, an increase in return abundance that seems to be reflected and up through 2022 and 2023. 2021 and 2022 here, these really high return years inshore to Bristol Bay seem to have been reflected in the abundance of juveniles captured in the surface trawl survey data when they're properly aligned to the return year. So we can look at this in a couple of different ways, right? We have this index or an index of juvenile sockeye aligned to the year in which they're going to return. We can predict run size as a function of that. We can do it based on the log of that index. And so this is just in general, the relationship between that high seas salmon index aligned to the return year and Bristol Bay run size in millions of sockeye salmon. This is from, I guess, 2005 all the way up through 2024. At least the fit is up through 2024, and you get a decent relationship, not the best in the world, but certainly not the worst from a preseason forecast perspective for Bristol Bay. And so we can look at this, and we just use the raw high seas salmon index here in thousands to predict Bristol Bay run size, R squared of about 0.73. If we use the natural log of that high seas index to predict Bristol Bay run size, R squared of about 0.63. Here we can look at it across time. These bars are the observed run sizes. These lines are at least the within sample predictions based on either the untransformed, that raw high seas index in thousands in red, or the natural log of that high seas index across time. And you do capture these periods of lower run size here after about 2010. Lags a bit, but you pick up this increase in this period after and including 2015 and these extremely high run size years in 2021 and 2022. Generally speaking, sort of mean absolute percent error between 11 and 12, 13% here. And in general, I think that the benefit is, one, it's sort of more independent of the methods that have been used for forecasting in the past, in that it's conditional on these juvenile survey data. It also provides kind of predictions 2 years in advance. So the predicted Bristol Bay run size through 2025 and 2026 is somewhere between 43 and 53 million sockeye. So kind of a useful look into the future about what might be coming. So some sense that we certainly turned the corner in 2021 and 2022, dropped down to a lower level in 2023 and 2024, and we may be looking at another ramp down here of 8 to 10 million fish over the next couple of years. Of course, at least from our purposes, we're also interested in sort of using these data to look on our river system by river system basis. And so if you take this kind of aggregate juvenile abundance index and you look at the relationship between that and run size by river system in Bristol Bay, something that harvesters really want to know, just given the way that the fishery operates with terminal fishing districts in which individual harvesters have to register. They're interested in which of the river systems are likely to have high abundance, so they can know from a harvester perspective where they want to drop their card, so to speak, or register to fish, or from a processing perspective, the major processors within the region are interested in how they're going to allocate their tendering capacity across fishing districts and across river systems more generally. So when we look at this on a river system by river system basis, generally speaking, there's a couple places where it seems to still have some predictive power, maybe Ugashik, Nushagak River, maybe the Agushik River to some extent, but for a lot of these river systems, just given their own variability, right, we don't see a great relationship between their run size and this high seas index of juvenile salmon abundance, again, aligned to the return year. So some overall kind of thoughts and cogitations. I do think these NOAA/ADF&G surface trawl survey data do provide a pretty robust predictor of Bristol Bay run size. I'll caveat that by saying that given when that survey started in 2002 and the fact that we're predicting a couple years in advance and aligning these juvenile indices, this is just across this, we can only evaluate performance across basically the last 20 years, and sort of what I've sort of looked at here is just sort of within sample predictive performance. You know, I think there's more work to be done to look at sort of leave one out cross validation. The standard kind of rolling or expanding window cross validation predict 1 year ahead out of sample based, predict 2001 based on data out through 2002. That sort of method is a little challenging given the sort of short time series to compare observations and predictions, but nonetheless, over this approximately 19-20 year period, mean absolute percent error of about 12% is certainly actionable from a fishery perspective. And I think most of our harvesters and or processors would agree. And importantly, as I've restated multiple times, that kind of the value in this kind of platform for prediction, or leveraging these data for prediction relative to the sort of classical salmon forecasting methods, are that we can look a couple years in advance. But importantly, as we saw in that kind of essential fish habitat case study as well, I mean, there's a lot of imbalance in the surface trawl survey data, given whether or not the southeastern Bering Sea is surveyed, which is incredibly important from a sockeye salmon perspective, given that the majority of their distribution is down there. There's also a lot of variation, as we saw over time, just given the level of survey effort that was available and the specific goals of that survey over time, which have changed to some extent. I think it's also important to highlight that sort of once we start burrowing down and looking at whether or not there's a relationship on the river system by river system level, it's not as good as we might expect, but okay for some particular river systems. There are some limited genetic composition of catch data from these surface trawl survey data. Jim and Lisa Sieve have a paper that looks at this over time. They haven't always been continuously collected, is my understanding. So the idea of sort of using the available survey genetic composition in conjunction with the actual catch per unit effort would be a little challenging, at least across the entire time series. I'll stop again and see if there are any questions or thoughts or ideas.
Yeah, if you have your hand raised, feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
So, do you have a list of the publications corresponding to these? It's a bit, it's interesting, but it's also kind of hard to picture in my head at the moment.
Yeah, I can certainly point them, send them over to you. So the EFH one that I was talking about is just sort of available online now at Canadian Journal. Lillian Hart would be the lead author, still in the process of sort of writing up this second one that I talked about.
Yeah. Have you also tried using other methods besides FAST?
Used STM-TMB in this latter case study for Bristol Bay predictions, and I mean, not unexpectedly, you end up with pretty similar predictions.
Okay, that's fair. Thanks.
Yeah. Sorry, I
We also
apologize.
have go ahead, Curry.
Oh no, I was just going to say I can't see hands, so feel free to interrupt. I should have mentioned that earlier.
Yeah, you're all good. We do have a question typed out from Ian Stewart. The relationship between the Kviak was surprisingly poor, especially since it is sometimes the single largest run. Any thoughts on why, and could it intercept with other districts potentially?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think generally speaking, over the period that we're comparing here, 2005 through 2024, is sort of after the Kviak cycle years, right, when it was a more dominant contributor. So I'm guessing, just given that we're looking at the sort of post Kviak reduction in sort of its dominance within the Bristol Bay, as a whole, we're sort of less likely to detect that. Is my guess on why we don't see a better relationship with the Kviak.
Hi, Curry. This is Caitlin Stern at Fish and Game. I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the model structures that you used for this project, since I've kind of read conflicting opinions about how to deal with this type of spatial imbalance in terms of the model structure that you use, like whether you use spatial autocorrelation or not.
Yeah, so there's no spatial autocorrelation. Sort of looked across basically whether or not we include spatial autocorrelation in those random fields or the spatiotemporal fields. It does include sort of autocorrelation in the intercepts in this case, so the year effects.
Thank you.
Alan, it looks like you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, hey Curry, this is Alan Hicks.
Hey, Alan.
Great talk, really super interesting. I really like that you have this predictions available 2 years in advance. That's a huge move forward, it seems to me. That's really cool. And I'm just trying to understand all this. Is a lot of information. But it seems like in this last little bit that the spatial footprint of the juveniles there's almost like this basin effect where there's a lot of juveniles, they tend to go over a larger area, but there seemed to be this little hot spot all the time that was consistent throughout.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you've thought, like, is there any way, and this is showing how naive I am to all this stuff, but is there any way to include other covariates that could maybe help predict that spatial footprint, or would it actually allow you to introduce some spatial prediction, maybe a better spatial prediction of the juveniles? And I don't know if it's of interest to get any sort of essential fish habitat of the juvenile area as well. But I don't know if you can see where I'm thinking along the lines here, but I'm just wondering if there's is there anything that you think could improve the prediction, not only of the adults in 2 years from now, but the juveniles in that year?
Yeah. So in terms of thinking about kind of the juveniles in that year, right, and the overall index of juvenile abundance, there's a couple different things. So pretty conclusively, Jim Murphy has demonstrated based on these data that controlling for mixed layer depth is really important from a catchability perspective. So he's shown that in the context of Chinook salmon, right? This idea, so we're talking about surface trawl, right? As your mixed layer depth gets shallower and shallower, if your juvenile salmon are distributed primarily above that mixed layer depth, your catchability is going to go up and up and up as they get squeezed towards the surface and sort of the vertical opening of the net. So thinking about that in a sort of juvenile sockeye context would be good. I think generally speaking, we might expect that juvenile Chinook have more heterogeneity in terms of their vertical distribution, although, I mean, it's hard to say that definitively. In terms of kind of other predictors, we have some additional work that was part of Lillian's master's that was looking at sort of the environmental predictors of juvenile salmon distribution, not just for sockeye, but thinking about things like sea surface temperature and bathymetry and things like that might play a role. And so I do think there's potential to leverage more of that information in this context as well, both for kind of informing catchability, as well as for sort of broader ecological inference about what drives distribution across time, for sure.
Yeah, great, thanks. I look forward to all of this.
All right. Again, I can't see hands, so just feel free to unmute yourself and interrupt me as we go through. The sort of next case study I wanted to talk about was, as I said, this sort of North Pacific scale synthesis of high seas survey data for salmon. And so I want to give a big shout out to Skip McKinnell, retired from DFO Canada, who had a major role in sort of identifying and compiling and digitizing these data, and Joe Lang, and pictured up here, who was a former postdoc in my lab, who led some of these analyses. But generally kind of taking a step back, so starting in the early to mid 1950s, there was an international push to better understand kind of the distribution and abundance amongst other processes for salmon in the high seas, first led by the INPFC and later by the North Pacific Anadromous Fish Commission. A wide variety of surveys have been conducted, primarily by the US, Canada, Russia, Japan, and Korea. The majority of these data kind of extend through the early 2000s. There are still some high seas sampling efforts. I don't want to discount that, but sort of the number of observations per year, the sampling intensity and effort year over year was certainly highest in the 50s through the 70s and even up through the 80s. So there were a couple goals of this project. One, Skip, who was one of the folks that was involved in some of these high sea surveys from a Canadian perspective, but also internationally, was one of the few folks who had been on these surveys and was still around and understood these data. And so we had a unique opportunity to partner with him in compiling these data together in one sort of digitized, standardized format that allowed us to conduct some further analyses. And so, I mean, just as an anecdote, right, steelhead weren't originally, there was no column for steelhead count in some of the standardized reporting, particularly on the Japanese side, but they would write in the comments if they encountered steelhead in some of these high seas catches. So Skip taught himself the character for steelhead and was incredibly instrumental in bringing these data together. Before I think we had the folks who had been involved were fewer and fewer, we'll put it that way. And so the objectives were basically to use these data to try to better describe the sort of North Pacific scale distribution of salmon by species and by month, by periods within the year. The majority of the high sea sampling effort up until the more recent international year of the salmon were primarily during the summer months, spring into summer, so April into September. As you can see here, and use this to better understand distribution and better understand sort of thermal preferences on a species by species basis. So just to kind of highlight the distribution of data across months and across years. So the top row of panels, so each of these points is an individual gear deployment. I've highlighted the sort of two main gear types that are contained within these data. So these would be gill net observations, high seas gill nets, and floating long lines here in blue, here by sort of decadal stanza. So this is 1955 up to 1972. This is 1973 up through 1990, and after basically 1990. And so the first thing you'll notice, as I've sort of alluded to, is that sort of high seas internationally led salmon survey effort has sort of declined over time. The majority of that sampling relative to the sort of March through or September through March period, kind of the winter time, or I guess fall into spring period, has primarily or was primarily in the summer. So thinking about June, July, August, May as well, and certainly no shortage of data in April. The other kind of major takeaway is that of the predominant two gears that were used, although there's some mixing across space, which is incredibly important and useful when we start to think about kind of intercalibration of catch rates amongst these two different gears that have very different units of effort, there was a general tendency for most of the high seas gill nets to be on the western side of the North Pacific, more of the kind of floating long line effort kind of mixed in the Western North Pacific, but more sort of heavier utilization, at least in the early period in the Eastern North Pacific. So we've got this sort of interesting spatial imbalance, not only in the survey observations across time, but also in the gear types that were used, when and where those particular gear types were deployed. So, you know, coming out of this sort of synthesis of the NPAFC survey efforts, right? There's about 42,000 observations, 43,000 observations between the early 50s and 2022. This includes activities by NPAFC member countries, as well as more recent efforts, both by NOAA, by DFO Canada, by a range of organizations. And so of the historical data, primarily the historical data, about 42% of these observations were from gill nets, 20% from floating long lines, about 11% from purse seines, particularly in and around in the Eastern North Pacific, around Vancouver Island and elsewhere in the Gulf of Alaska. There was historically a decent amount of sort of purse seine sampling. And then the remaining 27% or so were trawls, surface trawls, and use of other gears. Obviously, as we talked about in the last example, surface trawls are much more common now as a method of indexing, particularly juvenile salmonids, but in the past, primarily gill net and floating long line. One of the challenges, at least in terms of the initial analysis, we focused primarily on gill nets and floating long lines, the two kind of dominant gear types. that at least were most consistent across the majority of that time, but they have very different units of effort, right? When we're talking about a gill net or high seas gill net, we're talking about catch in numbers per, or catch in biomass, but primarily catch in numbers per 50-meter panel times the amount of soak time, which could be in days or hours. When we're thinking about floating long lines, right, we're talking about catch per number of skates, right? So each skate is 49 hooks. So kind of very different units of effort that we need to consider when we're trying to bring these data together and intercalibrate them. So for this kind of first paper here, looked at sort of trying to explain catch per unit effort as a function of a couple of different things to better understand kind of distribution across space on average by month and by species. So kind of thinking most generally about a general categorical gear effect, right, or overall differences in sort of fishing power catchability, a smooth year effect, given that, you know, we have a large number of years here. Spatially varying catchability, so this spatial field interacted with our categorical gear effect plus an average spatial field. Thinking about kind of Tweedy distributed errors, right? There were some zeros in these data, but not a ton. It was certainly species specific. We'll put it that way. We've also explored, in addition to sort of the GAM approach for kind of painting this picture of distribution across space, explored what might happen if we used a boosted regression trees for this context. So thinking about key features being latitude, longitude, month, of course, gear, allowing for interactions between these, and then also thinking about day of year as another feature that we can include in addition to kind of environmental covariates. And then leveraging these alongside kind of in situ observations of surface temperature within the top 3 meters. So I'll just sort of walk through a couple of the sort of major findings, right? So again, the goal being, okay, what is the sort of average distribution by month and by species? And again, this is an aggregate picture across many, many years. So this is a really coarse representation, but I think a really fun opportunity to ask this question at the North Pacific scale. And so this is for chum salmon, again, sort of thinking about relative abundance here, yellow, higher relative abundance, blue, lower relative abundance. And so you see some differences across time. So again, thinking about April into May, higher relative abundance south of the Alaska Peninsula. As we get into June and July, higher relative abundance further north of the Alaska Peninsula, again, continuing through August. So again, you know, I want to point out that the majority of these sort of high seas survey data were from the sort of spring and summer months, but there is this sort of evidence for this general northward shift into the Bering Sea. And again, this is on aggregate, right, into the Bering Sea beginning in June. And this sort of aligns with what's sort of generally been known about the migratory patterns for chum salmon, at least in that core region. This also plays into sort of when we think about kind of risk of bycatch for chum salmon in trout fisheries in the eastern Bering Sea, right? Not as for chum salmon, not as big an issue in the winter or at all, but come bee season, right, larger issue. And so this sort of overall shift in distribution kind of aligns with this idea. Prior to the spring and the summer, they're not arriving up into the Bering Sea, they're not coming north of the Alaska Peninsula, and then they're arriving up on the shelf. Looking at Chinook salmon, a little bit of a different story here. So just a sort of more spatially isolated predictions for areas of higher relative abundance. So April here, suggesting some areas here in you know, further out to sea, south of the Alaska Peninsula. Into May, a little more balanced. In June and July, this real hot spot right off of the eastern Bering Sea shelf edge. Kind of in this greenbelt zone, right? This area of high primary production, this area of mixing between deeper waters and up into the photic zone near or on the shelf is a higher area of predicted relative abundance for Chinook salmon in that region. by August, it's a little hard to tell, maybe some nearshore, inshore hotspots. Kind of narrowing in again, this is sort of one of the interesting features, right? Sort of on aggregate as we get into the summer months, so June and July, there's this predicted hotspot of relative abundance just off the shelf edge in the eastern Bering Sea, centered out here. Again, this aligns with some of the areas where there's higher primary productivity, kind of an interesting because the areas that the survey data pick out kind of align with sort of a leading potential hypothesis about what might be aggregating subadult Chinook salmon, particularly in that region and around productivity hotspots. One of the other questions, and again, going back to this sort of tools discussion, right, is sort of how different are your predictions depending on what sort of tool you use. So, I sort of described the general GAM structure. You fit a model. You can do it separately by species and by month. You can, account for the average gear effect or difference in catchability. You can account for spatially varying catchability as a function of this gear by spatial field interaction and generate your average spatial field. We can also feed this into a boosted regression tree with basically the same features and say, go forth and generate some spatial predictions by month. And look at how different those predictions are across time. So this is for sockeye salmon here, May, June, and July. These are predictions from the boosted regression tree. These are predictions from the GAM, right? So generally picking up somewhat similar areas, right? This sort of boundary condition at about 45 north where you don't find 45 to 50 north where you don't find any sockeye in any high abundance south of there as we get into the summer months. Generally speaking, the sort of pinpoint location of various hotspots are a little bit different and perhaps a little less well resolved when you use a boosted regression tree for spatial prediction in this context. You end up with this sort of blocky description of higher relative abundance here versus from a GAM perspective, right? You identify kind of more finely resolved, at least predicted hotspots of abundance across space, including up into Bristol Bay during the summer months, getting into June here. So again, some differences in sort of the predicted surface as we might expect based on the underlying machinery that I think can be useful in thinking about what our use case is and whether we care about identifying kind of fine scale hotspots conditional on our data versus kind of general zones, and also what is the sort of spatial distribution of those observations as they play into these different prediction frameworks. Look at the same thing for chum salmon, again, comparing boosted regression tree predictions versus GAM predictions. You end up with these odd kind of prediction here coming into the summer. Here further west as we get into June and July, and this is sort of I think an emergent property of GAMs that, depending on sort of how you constrain your smooths, can appear, right? So at the margins, right, if we have a prediction for as we move west and north, right, for your average spatial field, if you have a general increase across the range, right, that's going to continue out even if you have very few observations in that region. So again, this interaction between the flexibility in a spline context for describing these spatial fields may come at a bit of a cost if you have areas of kind of lower observation density. But generally speaking, right, if you kind of let your eyes glaze over, it seems like the same general areas of the North Pacific scale are being picked up as kind of higher versus lower relative abundance for chum salmon, at least in this case across the summer months. So predominantly, as we saw before, right, south of the Aleutians in May, as we move into June and July, kind of general northward distribution shift, at least predicted in this context or conditional on these data.
How confident are you in the distribution when you have such few samples? Did you look at the differences in the effects by changing the sample sizes?
So in general, when you say by changing the sample sizes, oh, by month, you mean?
Well, for example, if you have like no observations for May in a large area, but in June you have a hot spot, but then the following year you have a lot more sampling in May, but maybe you didn't sample as much in June because you thought that, well, we didn't sample enough, so maybe we should put more of our resources into sampling in May. Did you look at all at the, I don't know if I would call it a threshold size, but like I guess a confidence interval somewhere about how sure you are that that is what it is in some way. I'm not, there's many ways to go about it, and I'm not exactly sure the correct verbs, so I'm sorry for that, but
No, that's a great question. So like in an ideal case, we can do, and so acknowledging that this is the aggregate across years, right? So it
right.
really, it's a summary across years. But for a particular point in space, for a particular month, we can do this sort of spatially blocked cross-validation design where you withhold a spatial block by a month period and back predict that, right? Out of sample. And so that could ask, again, if we have consistent differences in the spatial distribution of sampling among months, it should predict that as being, doing a terrible job in some regions or in some region by month combinations. And so that works ongoing. That's a really good question. But again, sort of discretizing in space and then dropping out an individual spatial block by month and then back predicting it, I think is the best way that we can sort of get at that question. Yeah,
Thanks.
great idea. I think one of the fun things that we can do, again, kind of thinking about trade-offs between different methods, if we have day of year, as I said, as a feature in sort of the boosted regression trees, rather than trying to fit these sort of daily GAMs, we have the opportunity to kind of allow the interaction between day of year and the latitude and longitude features, and obviously any of the other features in the boosted regression tree to sort of generally generate predictions on sort of a daily basis. And I think one of the interesting things is sort of looking through this. And so this picture of me as a commercial fisherman back in 2006 as an undergrad, right? In fishing in Bristol Bay, as you're sitting kind of on your anchor chain waiting for the fish to show up at the beginning of the season, there's this question: when are they going to show up? Kind of where are they showing up from, right? You have 40 million fish return magically over the course of a couple weeks from seemingly nowhere, right? And so being able to leverage these data to ask this question of like, how does the sort of predicted relative abundance of sockeye conditional on these data shift across the season from spring here in April up through May? It seems like it follows through the Alaska Peninsula up into the Bering Sea, or at least up onto the Bering Sea shelf. And that generally aligns with what we see from the genetic composition of catches down here at South Unimak and Shumakin Islands, right about here. So the vast majority, 80 to 95% of fish sockeye caught down here in the fisheries that operate in June are Bristol Bay bound, suggesting that these Bristol Bay sockeye are hitting the south side of the Alaska Peninsula, turning the corner and ending up in Bristol Bay. It matches some of the early tagging studies that have been done. So Strati and others conducted some tagging studies on the sort of South Peninsula, tracking sockeye up into Bristol Bay. And again, you sort of see this similar pattern. Fish are kind of entering, passing through Falls Pass there and abouts, certainly further west in some years, turning the corner and heading up into Bristol Bay. And at least these high seas survey data seem to suggest a similar pattern, which is always a bit comforting. The other kind of piece of the puzzle that was really useful in this context, and so here's the reference to the paper, it came out last year in Fish and Fisheries, was to sort of leverage this comprehensive data set and the in situ temperature observations that were available to get a better understanding of sort of thermal preferences on a species by species basis. So what's plotted here is basically the core temperature range, so the 50% highest density interval for kind of the predicted CPUE, and the preferred temperature range, so the 80% highest density interval across species. So for sockeye, chum, the even and odd brood lines of pink salmon, chinook, steelhead, and coho or silver salmon down here. What we see is kind of a cross species. There's this sort of upper thermal preference limit. I won't say thermal tolerance limit, but a thermal preference limit, about 12.5 degrees Celsius, and it's pretty consistent across species. The major differences that we see are at the lower end of the preferred temperature range. So steelhead and coho, kind of what we would think of as maybe a little more sensitive to cold temperatures, right? Versus chum and sockeye that certainly see their preferred temperature range as well as their core temperature range shifted towards cooler temperatures, with Chinook salmon kind of being in the middle here. So maybe the more cold tolerant species being sockeye and chum salmon, as evidenced also by their kind of northward extent of their distribution and their range. Coho and steelhead, less so, pink and Chinook somewhere in the middle. I think one of the interesting things was also to sort of leverage this understanding of sort of thermal preferences conditioned within the context of the observations we have, and sort of pick out kind of cold periods and warm periods historically. So there's generally a cold period between 1983 and 1986, and a warm period between 2013 and 2016. And so in general, we can sort of ask the question of across species and across months, if we saw the temperature pattern during that warm period, this sort of 2013 to 2016 warm period, what is the expected difference in sort of suitability of spatial habitat, and how does that differ across species? So sort of painted in blue, this would be a negative suitability score, so that habitat becomes less suitable in warm years, or at least conditional on the data that we have. Here in red are sort of spatial regions or habitats conditional on their sea surface temperature, in which habitat suitability is expected to increase in a warm period. And so generally speaking, the biggest changes are for species like coho that, as we saw, are more temperature sensitive at the lower end, or are more sensitive to cold temperatures, are found less often in colder temperatures. And so moving into a kind of a warm period similar to 2013 to 2016, right, you expect throughout the summer higher habitat suitability further north, extending potentially into the sort of eastern Bering Sea, south side of the Alaska Peninsula, and up further north in areas that we tend to not see as many coho, or historically there had not been as many coho. For some of these other species, for sockeye and chum, in June, just generally increased sort of thermal habitat suitability further north as we get into the sort of northern Bering Sea region. As we start thinking about what that means for salmon entering the Arctic, I think we've had some follow-up research to kind of ask that question specifically, but generally it suggests that for at least for some of these species, chum salmon, perhaps pink salmon as well, that sort of change in temperature, or at least that general warming, leads to greater habitat suitability in the northern Bering Sea, but greater potential for potential movement up into the Chukchi and Beaufort Sea as well. But there's a whole separate paper on that I won't get into. So, kind of thinking about trade-offs and inference, right? These sort of North Pacific scale INPFC, NPFC data present, I think, like challenges and opportunities, right? And so, looking at any data set, right, there's trade-offs, right? The perfect data set does not exist as far as I know, but sort of thinking about the challenges, right? So, the spatial distribution of sampling effort is highly variable across the 50+ years over which, these surveys have been conducted. Obviously, there are more recent sampling efforts that are in more spatially isolated regions, and I don't want to discount those. I'm sort of thinking on aggregate, but it is generally, it has been highly variable. So this question of spatial imbalance is a real challenge. In addition to that, we can layer on top that, there's multiple gears that have been used at the North Pacific scale for indexing salmon. And so although they're primarily gillnet and long lines, there's these strong regional differences as we saw in that original map, right? High seas gillnets more often used for high seas sampling in the western North Pacific. High seas long lines more generally used in the eastern North Pacific, although there is areas of overlap, which hopefully give us enough power to sort of intercalibrate those gears. But again, a key challenge, right? There wasn't perfect mixing of observations of the two gear types across all points in space in all years. So, you know, you do what you can. At the same time, I think there's some great opportunities. So, you know, there's opportunities to describe these sort of species-specific average seasonal distributions at North Pacific scales. I think that's really exciting, especially kind of thinking about moving in from the sort of first case study where we were looking at juvenile salmonids, eastern and northern Bering Sea most generally, scaling that up to a North Pacific scale picture with the appropriate caveats and sort of questions, right, I think is a useful exercise. As is trying to better understand sort of these preferred temperature ranges that we can use to some extent to think about what a changing climate pattern means for our expected distribution on a species by species basis, right? So not talking about thermal tolerances, but just thinking about temperature preferences and what that means for potentially more overlap between species that have primarily avoided being north of the Alaska Peninsula and the Aleutian Chain in the past, perhaps being more present there in the future, and what that means from a fishery management perspective. Again, sort of thinking about this sort of imbalance in which gears were used where and across time to some extent, accounting for that spatially varying catchability in addition to the average difference in catchability is likely really important in this case. And when we start to compare predictions from different platforms that can be used for the same thing, they do kind of generally highlight common areas of higher or lower relative abundance. But there are differences we saw, right? Not unexpectedly, when you apply or employ a boosted regression tree for this sort of spatial prediction problem, you end up with these blocky spatial predictions, right? A whole bunch of decision trees being aggregated together, right? It sort of makes sense. There's also some interesting things that occur at the margins. So when we think about kind of high uncertainty regions at the margins of the observations, as I said, you know, the splines can do interesting things as you approach the margin. And I think it's just important to be aware of that and sort of think critically about whether or not the model-based estimate of uncertainty at the margins is truly reflective of kind of the spatial imbalance in the data, the lack of observations at the margins. I'll stop here and take another drink and see if there are any thoughts or questions here. Again, forgive me for not being able to see hands.
I'm not seeing any hands, so I think you're all good to go on and keep going.
Perfect. I'll move into our kind of third case study. And generally speaking, this is sort of thinking about how we can better understand kind of Pacific herring distribution in the Eastern Bering Sea relative to some static spatial management measures that come into play, and I'll talk more about those. But sort of thinking about how we can ask the question, are these static spatial boundaries still reflective of the distribution of herring within this region or not, right? Highly mobile pelagic species, probably subject to some changes in distribution associated with variation in climate patterns. I would be a strong advocate for reevaluating our assumptions periodically. So kind of taking a step back, and I think probably important for folks outside of the region where I reside, you know, there are spatial conservation and bycatch management measures in the Eastern Bering Sea, and they generally fall into sort of two, and I'm generalizing here, into sort of two kind of fundamental categories. We have static spatial management measures for conservation or kind of bycatch mitigation and savings areas that sort of protect core habitat areas, areas that are important for feeding for other species that are either kind of seasonally closed or opportunistically closed. If a threshold, maybe a bycatch threshold, is exceeded, they can operate in a variety of different ways, but the actual spatial definitions are somewhat fixed in space across time. They may not always operate all the time, but they're certainly, for the most part, fixed in space. Again, I'm generalizing a bit. At the other end of the spectrum, we can think about kind of dynamic spatial management measures, sort of the rolling hotspot closure program being a primary example, where real-time information on bycatch rates, for example, are used to draw the boundaries of these sort of temporary closure areas from which either all vessels or a subset of vessels may be excluded over a period of time. So again, the fundamental difference being in the dynamic context, leveraging sort of real-time, in this case, bycatch information to describe the spatial extent and location of those closure areas versus something that's more static in space and time. In the context of Pacific herring bycatch management, there's a series of time area closures that were established in 1991. So over here on the map on the right, this is the winter herring savings area, which can be in place from September 1st to March 1st if triggered. This is the summer herring savings area number 1, which can be in place from June 15th to July 1st, again, if put into play in a given season, and the summer herring savings area number 2, which can operate from July 1st to August 15th. So functionally, the way this works is that, you know, if in a given year the prohibited species catch limit or bycatch limit for herring for Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands groundfish fisheries is set at 1% of the forecasted Eastern Bering Sea herring biomass. If that's exceeded by a particular sector or the allocation of that is exceeded by a particular sector, these sort of spatial areas can be closed to active fishing effort for a period of time. And the exact sort of stipulations of that depend on kind of when it's exceeded and by how much and for how long, right? And so I was sort of interested in asking, you know, given that these spatial areas were drawn with, you know, a lot of information back in 1991, are they still relevant today, right? We think about herring being a pretty highly mobile species, probably pretty sensitive in their distribution to environmental forcing. Maybe they're moving north, maybe they're moving elsewhere. So what proportion of the relative abundance of herring year over year is actually within these herring savings areas? How effective are they likely to be? And also, you know, what environmental factors are associated with sort of spatial variation in herring abundance? Kind of what processes drive the variation we see? And so I did want to point out as well, so since 1991, the winter herring savings area has only been enacted 5 times. The summer herring savings area is only about 2 times since that point, with a couple notable examples in the recent past. So big thank you to Abby Johns at the Alaska NOAA Regional Office for actually looking up in the Federal Register how often this had occurred. So in terms of kind of thinking about herring distribution in this region more generally, you know, I'm far from the first person to kind of ask these questions. So there had been some prior work to sort of ask this question based on sort of fishery dependent data. And so there was a paper from 2007 here in deep sea research that used fishery dependent data from 1977 up through 2003 to understand kind of the seasonal migratory pathway for herring in this region, and ask this question about kind of environmental associations, sort of thinking about basically the sort of differences in the center of gravity or distribution for herring as inferred from these fishery dependent data as a function of sort of sea ice extent, right? So what drives distribution, which can have an impact on spawn timing. So in general, the story of herring is that there's some general kind of overwintering grounds, at least as identified by this paper, out here in 2 areas. Generally, there's an onshore migration that starts in April or May. fish arrive inshore in May or June. So I participated in the Togiak herring fishery for a couple years, generally in May, kind of prior to when sockeye are returning to Bristol Bay in June and July. The timing can be highly variable, and that's sort of a key challenge, right? You know, from a processing perspective and harvester perspective, you need to be up there and be ready for the herring spawn, but year over year, it can be quite different. So you need to tool up, be ready to go, and then maybe sit around for a long period of time. And generally, folks will talk about kind of sea ice within this region in the preceding winter being a pretty reliable predictor of sort of herring timing, right? Perhaps not unexpectedly. So these fishery dependent data sort of describe this sort of general pattern: onshore migration, herring sort of turning the corner and moving upwards. So the sort of timing of spawning proceeds northward from kind of Togiak here up and around in areas further north in Western Alaska. These herring sort of generally follow maybe a clockwise progression, turning the corner, following the Alaska Peninsula down, back over to overwintering ground, certainly some going north and following that same pattern, but generally moving onshore to offshore over the course of the summer to overwinter further out. They also found that there was this sort of general association between the center of gravity for the distribution in years of higher sea ice extent might be a little further south versus lower sea ice extent a little further north. Perhaps not unexpectedly, but kind of aligning with, we start thinking about what drives timing. Part of that is sort of where you start your spawning migration, whether or not you're further outside of maybe the coastal domain. There's also been some really good work more recently. So Cody Schwalski does the sort of describes herring abundance from surface trawl and bottom trawl surveys in the Forage Fish Safe or Forage Fish Report. And so you can kind of think about sort of what that predicts about distribution. Of course, herring are a bit difficult to sample. They're caught in bottom trawls maybe as they're descending or ascending. They are caught in surface trawls, but again, that's sort of a snapshot of one point in the year, which always makes it a little bit challenging. There's also been some really exciting work done by so there was a paper in MAPS in 2023. Kayla Gunther and Matt Baker looked at, in collaboration with folks at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, sort of thinking about what you can infer about herring distribution from their presence and contribution to the diets of major predators within the region. So thinking about walleye pollock, Pacific cod, Pacific halibut, and arrowtooth as potential species that are eating not only herring, but in this case, in the context of the figures I pulled out, herring. So we look at the points here, these are basically diets and the relative contribution of herring to those diets, the diets of these predators. They also looked at, again, sort of thinking about what we can infer about herring distribution in this region from their presence in predator diets and sort of the center of gravity in warm, average, or cold years. And they didn't find much evidence for kind of north and southward shifts. But again, when we think about the different ways that we can describe where herring are likely to be in their distribution, we can rely on sort of survey data that, you know, maybe are not perfect samplers in many cases for herring, and also represent a snapshot in this case of the surface trawl surveys we were talking about in the fall of the year, late summer. We can rely on predator diets caught in bottom trawl surveys, but again, they're conditional on the distribution of the predator, and again, a snapshot for a specific point in the year. So, you know, I was interested in sort of going back to the work that had been done previously and asking, can we use sort of fishery dependent bycatch data in Eastern Bering Sea trawl fisheries to understand sort of herring savings area occupancy and maybe the environmental processes that are related to herring distribution, or at least kind of catch per unit effort in trawl fisheries. And so the kind of input data here are really from the Eastern Bering Sea pelagic trawl catcher processor fleet. And so in general, the data are confidential, but I pulled this from the incentive plan agreement report. So this is all good. We can look at this. But generally, you know, after I filtered out hulls that didn't have reported latitude, longitude, date, depth, tow duration in minutes, and sort of all the fields that I really wanted to have. There were about 98,000 individual hulls that had been observed. So a huge shout out to the fisheries monitoring program, the observer program at NOAA AFSC. I mean, this is an incredible amount of onboard observer effort to come, to feed in the observations for this, but it provides us potentially a different way of learning something about Pacific herring distribution and overlap with these herring savings areas. And so I sort of used it in two ways. One, these fishery dependent data, again, thinking about this underlying theme of spatial imbalance, right? They're out there. These are vessels that are targeting pollock, so they're going to where the pollock are. They have different restrictions. They have different product forms depending on the season. And so, obviously they're not going out there to provide a good survey of herring, but at the same time, while there's some herring avoidance in some years, hopefully this provides some useful information. So using kind of vast models to describe the distribution and herring savings area occupancy, so thinking about number of herring caught per trawl minute in this case, and then catch per unit effort and trawl minute, thinking about modeling the natural log of that in a boosted regression tree context, using kind of a range of climate, environmental, and sort of space-time predictors to say, okay, what can we learn about the general distribution of herring conditional on these fishery dependent data, and also kind of what factors might predict where you're likely to see more or fewer herring across time. So just to sort of give folks an understanding of kind of the data that were in hand, right? So A season generally in this region, the A season generally extends through the winter into the spring. B season is sort of summer into fall, potentially up to kind of the start of the new year, depending on how far fishing effort extends. And so we can see generally broken out. So A season is here in blue, B season is here in orange, kind of the distribution of observed catcher processor fishing events in the Eastern Bering Sea pelagic trawl fishery and the pollock fishery out there. We'll see, there is variation across time in the number of fishing events, or at least observed fishing events in this case. These tend to align with some of the I guess, regulatory actions. So thinking about AFA and driving some of this in the catcher processor fleet is pretty important. But generally, this just shows sort of the distribution of observations in time. Although the data are confidential, we can show these sort of smooth descriptions of kind of the intensity of fishing events between seasons and among years, just to give everybody kind of an idea of, again, this question of spatial imbalance. So this is for A season, again, that winter season. So you see more of harvesting effort down here. So pollock are spawning, right? Fisheries might be targeting roe to a higher extent during this period of time, more fishing effort in this area. As we get into B season, obviously targeting different product forms, the distribution of pollock is distributing further along the shelf break, further north, less restricted by ice, amongst other things. So generally the fishing effort does vary. The spatial distribution of fishing effort does vary quite a bit between A and B season, as we might expect, given different targeting of pollock in different areas, given their life history. We can also look across time. Again, I'm just sort of smoothing so we can get around sort of confidentiality requirements, but or remain consistent with confidentiality requirements. Here, this is for A season, and again, we see that although the general distribution of the highest amount of fishing effort tends to be kind of further to the south and the east here, closer to the Alaska Peninsula, there's quite a bit of variability over time, even for the wintertime fishery. At least from a catcher processor perspective. Again, this is just sort of one of the 3 fleets that are targeting pollock out there. And then in B season, again, sort of further north and west generally, but even over time, you see some seasons in which, the majority of fishing effort is not quite as far north and west. In some years, it's predominantly north and west. And again, folks from the fleet side could probably tell us exactly what that was driven by. It may be bycatch avoidance, it may be high target catches, it may be driven by other things in particular years. But again, all to paint this picture that, yeah, we have variation across time in the distribution of fishing events. And that's something we need to consider in this context. So kind of thinking about sort of generating some idea of the relative abundance, and I'm going to keep sort of hammering on this is sort of the relative abundance of herring across space and amongst years. So in this case, we have independent spatial fields, independent year effects. Sort of drew the spatial domain that over which we're sort of fitting to these data and predicting based on kind of the generalized average distribution of fishing events, acknowledging that as you move sort of further north and west, there tend to be fewer fishing events. Same thing as you get out into deeper water, but generally the region of the majority of fishing effort from the pollock fishery. What I have here, sort of the predictions across space and time for herring, sort of bycatch per tow minute. You'll see that on aggregate across years, right, sort of overall some years have sort of higher expected catch or catch per unit effort for herring. I've drawn in, this is just for A season, I've drawn in that winter herring savings area right here. Again, it wasn't enacted in every year, in fact, in few of these years, but we can ask the question, in across time, do we see the area with the highest relative abundance of herring being predominantly within the domain of this box, right? It would be kind of a tall order, but reasonable to ask. And more generally, we can ask kind of what proportion of the relative abundance across space potentially lies within this box, or at least that's the way I was thinking about approaching this question. And I'm curious to hear from others on whether or not that makes sense. But generally speaking, we can do that and ask, okay, across the extrapolation grid. So again, it's conditional on the area over which you're predicting relative abundance. What proportion of the relative abundance actually ends up in sort of the herring savings area? And so we see that in some years, like 2000, better than 50% of the overall predicted relative abundance of herring kind of lies within the domain of that herring savings area. If it were enacted that year, it would be a sort of really good conservation measure for herring. In other years here, like 2004, right, again, decent proportion of the predicted herring relative abundance was within the domain. Beyond that, it kind of bounces around about 10%, right? There's years, right, in which, the predicted distribution of herring is sort of further south, or at least herring relative abundance conditional on these data. In other years, it seems to be a little closer, but maybe not right within. Right, so it varies across time at about 10% on average. We can ask these sort of same questions about the B season and the summer herring savings areas. Again, not enacted in every year, but we can ask the question conditional on fishery dependent observations from the pollock fishery, what proportion of relative abundance of herring within this colored spatial domain actually was likely to be within the summer herring savings area. And we see that, often here, so this is herring savings area number 1, summer herring savings area number 1 and number 2. So we can think about those separately. But in general, there's quite a few years where the kind of relative abundance of herring is predicted to be kind of further north and west compared to other years, right? And so ideally, right there, part of this could be driven by the distribution of fishing effort, but ideally not completely, given that we have this sort of average spatial field and spatiotemporal fields, right? And we're leveraging the correlation structure in these observations to fill in gaps in space and time, and hopefully there's at least enough information. But generally speaking, in some of these years, the distribution of herring in the summer, as inferred from these data, is further north and west than it would be in the and a relatively small proportion, that predicted relative abundance, is likely to be within the herring savings area. So if we look at herring savings area number 1, that's that smaller one up there, pretty small proportion of the predicted relative abundance of herring actually predicted to reside in that region, at least from this look at it. Herring savings area number 2, summer herring savings area number 2. In select years, right, predicted relative abundance of herring really high in herring savings area number 2. Other years like 2004 here, again, seems to align, but beyond that, again, same thing about, you know, a little more variable when we talk about the summer herring savings areas, but 10% bouncing around there, somewhere between, you know, 20 and 5% in most years.
Are you averaging, I guess, the value across the entire spatial extent, and then within each box, you're averaging the value to get the proportion?
Exactly. So just within, not over the entire spatial extent, just over this extrapolation domain that's sort of pictured there in color.
Okay.
So it's not the full distribution of herring by any means, but it's representative of the general distribution of the fishery dependent observations we have. So we're not sort of predicting too far out into the unobserved areas.
Okay.
Yeah. I would say, you know, the other piece of this puzzle, as I talked about, is sort of leveraging these sort of same observations to start thinking about the environmental processes that lead to sort of that might be associated with the distribution of herring as inferred by these fishery dependent data across seasons. And so looked at this again in the boosted regression tree context, kind of thinking about event level predictors, the kind of standard stuff, latitude, longitude, day of year, bottom depth, the year, right? And then some sort of broad scale monthly ecosystem predictors. So sea ice extent and total area, some variability in kind of large scale climate indices. So thinking about North Pacific gyre oscillation, PDO, kind of El Nino, kind of some of these broad things that might be associated with, you know, do we see warm or cold temperatures? Do we see potentially interact with high and low sea ice extent and other processes that might influence herring distribution? And so across these features, we can, you know, from an inferential perspective, kind of think about, okay, what's the relative importance of these features? Which ones should we perhaps pay attention to if we're interested in predicting where you have higher or lower CPUE for herring in the Eastern Bering Sea, or at least on the Eastern Bering Sea shelf edge generally. And so the features that had the highest importance, right? So thinking about what this means, right? Removing that feature leads to a greater reduction in sort of explanatory power or kind of out of sample predictive performance, right? So latitude, longitude seem to be important. So your kind of average spatial field and day of year. So kind of your spatial temporal aspect to that seem to be really important, followed by year. Sort of beyond those, kind of beyond the ones that are kind of less interesting that we might expect probably should be important in this context. Bottom depth here and sea ice area, Arctic sea ice area seem to be the next most important features. So thinking about kind of what they tell us here are kind of partial plots, thinking about kind of the change in predicted CPUE or log CPUE in this case, across the range of values for that feature, generally suggests that you have kind of higher predicted CPUE for herring in these areas that are about 50 fathoms. By about 100 fathoms, you're not seeing a ton of herring, at least as indexed by the trawl fishery. Certainly that's to some extent driven by where we see observations from the trawl fishery, but certainly suggests that you're not seeing herring super far off the shelf edge. The other interesting one is that higher herring CPUE or herring CPUE seems to increase quite a bit once Arctic sea ice extent sort of exceeds about 12 million square kilometers. So again, this idea that, which is not new, but again, looking at it in a different way, right? In winters in which you have a larger sea ice extent or sea ice extent over 12 million square kilometers, you tend to see higher CPUE in the pollock fishery. So again, thinking about sea ice driving herring distribution, leading to greater overlap and higher bycatch risk, at least in the context of this fishery, would be my interpretation of that. So just a couple of thoughts on sort of this piece of the puzzle here, right? you know, Pacific herring do seem to, you know, they do exhibit sort of dynamic seasonal distributions in the Eastern Bering Sea. And so when we think about the efficacy of these static spatial management measures, you know, it likely depends on things like winter sea ice and other ecosystem processes, right? When we thought about the proportion of the relative abundance within that spatial domain that was within that those herring savings areas, it was usually less than 10 to 20%, and it varied a lot depending on the year. So I think it sort of begs the question, right? When we draw these boundaries now more than 30 years ago, how, you know, as ecosystems change, how frequently do we or should we reevaluate the efficacy of these spatial management measures? And this may not be, others may have better ideas on more appropriate ways to do this, but I think it's a question we should be asking. I also kind of on this particular case study, it's pretty interesting that across since their implementation in 1991, the herring savings areas had only been enacted, I think, what is it, 5 times, basically 5 times and 2 times for the other, which suggests that the fleet on its own is generally doing a pretty good job of avoiding herring bycatch. And so it kind of begs the question of what is the purpose of these herring savings areas? And maybe them being optimally placed, and when I say optimally placed such that they encompass the majority of potential herring relative abundance across years, is less important than their placement as a mitigation strategy. That the incentive for bycatch avoidance based on where you're excluded from may actually be more important than their placement relative to the distribution of herring, right? If there's high target catch rate within the domains of that box, there's a real strong incentive to avoid going into the penalty box in that case. I'm going to skip over the next couple slides, which are more about sort of fishery dependent data and chum bycatch, and sort of skip to the end, so maybe we can have a little bit of conversation, so I'm not droning on. But you know, I sort of scratched my head, and for a symposium we had last spring, kind of put together my thoughts in this figure and kind of trade-offs and considerations across sort of the different SDM frameworks that we talked about today. So, right, we think about generalized additive models, we can have smooth space-time interactions, we can have spatial interactions that are independent amongst years. You know, there's, like anything, right, there's trade-offs, right? They're easy to interpret, they're fairly easy to implement. We can think at the other end of the spectrum over here, we have boosted regression trees, and we can have space-time interactions between them. One of the downsides, they're pretty data hungry from particularly a hyperparameter tuning perspective. And so, you know, one of the benefits we can, as we saw in that sort of sockeye North Pacific scale example, we can sort of think about generating daily predictions for sort of expected distribution across time. That would be a little bit, I think, challenging in a GAM context to implement. We can have kind of complex and nonlinear covariate interactions. We can think of the sort of other tool that we've sort of explored today, right? Thinking about estimation platforms that leverage Gaussian Markov random fields. So thinking about VAST or SDM-TMB, I don't mean to be sort of exclusive in terms of the framework, but generally things that deal with space using random effects. You know, there's, in the same way we can in GAMs, we can specifically codify our assumptions about kind of autocorrelation in both our year effects, but more importantly in our spatial fields. So getting back to this question that Caitlin had, right, when we're thinking about spatially imbalanced data, I think one of the questions is how much information we want to share in terms of the predicted spatial field or the components of the predicted spatial field across time, right? Do we want to treat that as an autoregressive or a random walk process? And you know, I think at the end of the day, I sort of come back to there being trade-offs between all these platforms when we start thinking about, you know, spatially imbalanced data that arise in a variety of cases, from sort of fishery independent data from surveys that change in their spatial footprint or the intensity of sampling across time, to fishery dependent data. There's likely to be some trade-offs. And while GAMs are easy to implement, they can often, across these case studies, do some really odd things at the margin. And so, as Joe Lang would say, a spline is going to spline. So it will do what it does. But at the end of the day, I sort of go back to the recommendation from my high school pottery teacher, Mrs. Voris, who said of pottery, form follows function. So I think the form of the model we choose should follow kind of what we're hoping to get out of it. And hopefully we can continue considering different platforms and the trade-offs between them.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Curry. That was a great presentation, and we've had some really good questions already. So we'll go ahead and open it up to the audience one more time to ask Curry any questions they might have.
I have successfully put everyone to sleep.
Don't worry, you have had a engaging talk, and there have been definitely a few that have not been so engaging. So I think this was a successful think tank.
I have a question, Curry, if that's okay.
Yeah.
This is Caitlin. I'm just wondering, like, kind of stepping back a little bit, what common pitfalls are you seeing when you look at the use of spatiotemporal models to generate indices of abundance? I know this is something that's coming into stock assessments more and more, and I'm wondering if there are any kind of areas that you think a lot of people are missing or things that we need to consider more carefully.
Yeah, I think from sort of the spatiotemporal model, the stock assessment perspective, one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about more recently is how we deal with changes in sort of catchability and whether or not that should be done on the sort of index standardization end of the spectrum, sort of the spatiotemporal model end of the spectrum, if that's the tool that's being used, or on the stock assessment end of the spectrum. And this comes up repeatedly in sort of the discussions about the ongoing survey modernization effort at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, right? Some of these differences in gear might be addressed kind of internally within the index standardization model or in the stock assessment. And I think there's a lot of really smart people sort of thinking about how we do that. And that's always an open question in my mind, like where do we handle that change, right? Thinking more generally, I love using GAMs for this context because they're super easy to implement, and you can kind of implement parallel structures to many of the other model forms, at least across VAST and SDM-TMB. Obviously, the estimation of spatial effects is very different, and there's trade-offs. But again, that sort of thinking about what your smooth, and you can address this in terms of your basis to some extent, thinking about what your spline does in the absence of information, particularly as you move out into the northern extent maybe of your stock, is really important because really odd things can happen. So again, thinking about kind of accurately trying to show, and so we've tried to sort of think about in most of these cases kind of scaling the transparency based on the uncertainty or 1 over the CV squared. But yeah, thinking about kind of uncertainty in predictive spatial services and sort of how we best describe that, right, to audiences, whether that audience is a council or stakeholders or whoever it is. Yeah, and I guess the other one is that boosted regression trees are increasingly kind of a part of the toolkit that I use, just because we can look at a wide variety of features, but you do need a lot of observations, right? We're in less so in a kind of spatiotemporal context, but in other contexts, we can end up with these sort of short but wide data sets that are particularly challenging. But I guess less so in these sort of spatial contexts.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Maurice, looks like you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks, Curry. I really enjoyed your talk, and kind of thinking more about like extrapolation and these differences in how GAMs or VAST or whatnot extrapolate. And you've touched on this. One of the things that like VAST will do, right, because it's a GMRF, is sort of decay to the mean as you go out, as you extrapolate space time, and that would not produce those weird hotspots in the margin, but it introduces this new question of like, is the mean reasonable to extrapolate at when like, maybe your spatial sampling is kind of biased towards where the species is. So this is maybe kind of a wicked question, but like,
Oh yeah.
What does it mean to, like, what is a principled way to extrapolate? If you had like an ideal model, like how would you want that model to extrapolate these distributions, and would that kind of be context dependent?
Totally. I mean, in this, we have some other work going on with sort of looking at fishery dependent data from the Pequod fixed gear fleet in the Bering Sea, and right, like they don't go up into like inshore in Bristol Bay all that often. There's parasite issues inside, and so you end up reverting to the mean up there. So you sort of in practice, and this was done for the purpose of the assessment in some of the work that Jim Thorson and others had done. In generating a fishery dependent index, and we've sort of followed suit, right? You sort of restrict to the spatial domain of the observations as best you can. And so I think, as a field, it would be useful for us to think about or have some simulation analysis, better yet, right? To think about, okay, what proportion of your observations across space and time within a given portion of the spatial domain is sufficient, right? And so it kind of depends on your use, because you're exactly right. It'll revert to the mean in that area, right? That's your best estimate, which maybe is not a problem if you sort of acknowledge that and say, actually, we aren't going to look at that area because we really have no idea what's going on. But in other contexts, that reversion to the mean can be really important in bias inference. And so, yeah, I don't know. It's a really good question. I don't know that I have a satisfactory answer.
Yeah, I don't know that anyone does. It's just like, it's one of those things where I deal with this sort of extrapolation problem too sometimes, and musing about how I would actually want this to work is something I've never arrived at an answer for myself. But yeah, I really enjoyed your talk, so thank you so much.
Yeah, there, and I'll just sort of highlight an example. So Kimberly Fitzpatrick is a postdoc in my lab, and she's looking at sort of Pequod, CPUE, Eastern Bering Sea, and again, at least in B season, in the summer season, the fleet doesn't very often go up into those warmer coastal waters because of parasite issues. But if you're thinking about, and one of the questions that we're asking is sort of whether or not the distribution of fishing effort aligns with catch rates, or kind of our best perception of distribution of the stock, and kind of what drives distribution of fishing effort in a general sense. And if you generate a vast model prediction for basically abundance of Pequod across space, that mean out there suggests that there's a bunch of Pequod up there that the fleet might target. And in reality, there's valid reasons for not. One, we actually don't know that they're up there, and two, based on the fishery dependent data alone, and two, there's sort of really important reasons for why the fleet doesn't target them up there that are kind of smoothed over to some extent.
Good. Anyone else have any final questions for Curry? Oh, Catherine, looks like you have your hand raised.
Hi, Curry. This is Kat. Thanks so much. That was It was a really wonderful talk. I think you've given me a lot to really kind of chew on for a little while. So my question is actually just whether or not you'd be willing to share your slides.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you. It's a lot to unpack. Appreciate it.
Yeah, just shoot me an email. Happy to do so.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Okay, well, it looks like we're just approaching 11:30, so that's perfect timing. So let's go ahead and give Curry once again a big round of applause for another wonderful think tank. And I will see hopefully all of you back in 2 weeks as we have our third think tank for the quarter with Steve Kadrin over at UMass Dartmouth. A bunch of thanks for the great talks in the chat from a lot of people, Curry. So thank you again, and I look forward to seeing you all in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, and thanks for listening to my rambling story. Take care, everyone.